It's said that home is where the heart is, but sometimes nothing could be further from the truth. She was a talented young actress with unlimited potential.
She was known to millions for her role in one of the UK's most popular television shows.
Until she vanished into thin air.
She'd not been seen for 2 days. It was entirely out of character.
There was very little information suggesting where she was.
The investigation into her disappearance would take a terrifying turn and uncover a dangerous rivalry fueled by jealousy and anger. The 3rd of March 2012. It's a typical Saturday evening for the officers on duty in London's East End. But when 3 people show up at the station to report a young woman missing, it becomes a night none of them will ever forget.
The 2 men identified themselves as the missing woman's brother, Tony and Danny, and the friend as Nicole.
They're filling out the report, and as soon as they get to the name, the officers know this isn't going to be a typical case.
The person that was missing was Gemma McCluskie. She was an actress, most famously been in EastEnders, which is a very famous soap. Everybody in Britain has seen this programme.
They said that she'd not been seen for 2 days.
The last person to have seen Gemma was her brother. She lived with Tony and her mother in the flat in Shoreditch.
Tony said she'd left the house on Thursday, but she hadn't said how long she was going for, where she was going, anything.
He said it was out of character for her to be missing for this length of time.
Given the circumstances of her disappearance, police aren't initially that concerned.
It was considered and recorded as a low-risk investigation at that stage.
But with each passing hour, that assessment begins to change.
Gemma was an avid user of social media. She had lots of friends and was always online, texting and speaking to her friends and family, and nobody had heard from her.
At 17, she landed this plum job, an absolute dream for a girl of that age, to appear in EastEnders.
She was in more than 30 episodes playing Kerry Skinner. She was linked to quite a few of the major characters and in a number of memorable storylines.
However, just as her star seemed to be rising, Gemma's career suffered a major blow.
1 minute, she's on top of the world doing what she loves. The next minute, she's written out of the series.
She still had huge hopes and ambitions to be a success on stage and screen.
In late 2011, Gemma's mother was diagnosed with a brain tumour, and she had to go into hospital for the treatment.
Her diagnosis came as a huge blow to Gemma and to the rest of the family. And to make matters worse, she contracted an infection, which meant that she had to remain hospitalised.
Since then, Gemma had devoted her life to taking care of her mother, visiting her in the hospital daily.
But now, 6 weeks after her mother was hospitalised, Gemma has mysteriously disappeared, and her loved ones have begun to fear the worst.
On that morning, she'd gone to the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. A new wing was being opened because a friend of hers was in the child school choir and was singing.
She was photographed at the ceremony wearing a distinctive yellow leggings with a Louis Vuitton handbag, and she recorded the cell phone.
As time went on, there was a growing concern about where Gemma was and what had happened. There was a campaign set up to try and find her. They had missing persons posters, and even some of her co-stars from EastEnders were sending out messages on social media.
I can only imagine being a friend or a family member. I mean, your mind just wanders to some pretty dark places.
Hours after filing the missing persons report, Gemma's family receives a possible tip.
Friends were making inquiries locally and they went into a kebab shop. And one of the people that was serving in there said that they thought they remembered Gemma coming in on the Thursday evening.
The last person to see Gemma had been her brother Tony, so news of another sighting not only brought a lot of hope, it also helped narrow down the time to when she was last seen.
One of the officers went into the kebab shop, spoke to the individual that had given that account.
But unfortunately, when police check the shop's CCTV cameras for the night of the 1st of March, they come up empty.
It became apparent that mistaken that Gemma hadn't actually been there that night.
But then, 5 days into the search, Gemma's older brother Tony is contacted by someone who claims to know exactly where Gemma is.
Tony received a series of telephone calls on the 6th of March where somebody was purporting to have Gemma and was demanding a ransom for her return.
The first call, the demand was to bring £2 million to Benfleet International Station if he ever wanted to see her alive again.
On the second call, the chap demanded the same amount of money plus $500 in Iraqi money.
When Tony asked to speak to his sister, the supposed kidnapper said she'd been stripped of her clothes and was being held in a room.
Investigators quickly traced the call to an address over 30 miles away in Kent.
I deployed a number of officers to go to that address to identify the actual individual that made the calls and then to arrest that person.
It turns out the whole thing was just a cruel hoax.
It was a sad teenage man who had no connection with the case whatsoever.
The chap tells us that he had been with a lot of his mates, drinking and smoking weed that day, that they'd found online this poster requesting any information about Gemma's disappearance, and they thought between them that it would be a bit of a laugh to torment the person that were requesting that information.
He was prosecuted on that basis.
He got charged with an offence under the Malicious Communications Act, for which he did eventually serve a prison sentence.
Within hours of the ransom calls, police received a report about a suspicious object floating in Regent's Canal, close to Hackney's famous Broadway market.
A woman navigating a barge down the canal came across a suitcase. And when it was fished out, the spring just immediately opened and the most gruesome sight imaginable was inside.
It was the headless torso of a woman, and there were distinguishing marks that suggested it was the partial remains of Gemma McCluskie.
We were aware that Gemma had a butterfly tattoo on the small of her back, and that was what the torso had.
The remains are brought to the medical examiner, who confirms the identification.
DNA tests soon confirmed this was in fact Gemma's body, and this alarming news quickly spread across London. What started as a missing persons case was now a murder investigation. But there was no sign of the head, and without this evidence, there was no way of determining the cause of death.
And the big question now was, who would want to kill Gemma McCluskie and why?
Over the course of the next few days, they found a series of limbs that had been disposed of in rubbish bags.
They were all recovered at different times and in different locations. They were packaged in a similar way.
A pathologist confirms that the severed limbs came from Gemma's body, but there are also signs that whoever killed her wasn't simply trying to get rid of the evidence.
When the pathologist looked at the torso, there were some marks and bruises on the body. But the things that were shocking about it was that there'd been nearly 100 hacks or axe marks to the torso.
The first thing they had to do was to find out exactly where Gemma had been on the day that she disappeared, so they could trace a timeline of her movements.
Investigators know that she attended a ceremony at a hospital in Whitechapel the morning she disappeared. Her friend Erica had a daughter who was singing in the choir there, and Gemma recorded it for her.
After the events finished, Gemma goes to her friend's house to show her friend footage of the daughter singing.
Erica told police she was thrilled to see the video, and they'd all had a couple of drinks, gone round to hers, had a bit of a party.
But Erica now recalls that Gemma seemed agitated during the party. When she asked her what was wrong, Gemma said she'd had a fight with her 35-year-old brother, Tony.
She lived there with her brother, Tony, and her mother, Pauline, albeit Pauline had been in a local hospital for a 6-week period.
Tony and Gemma, they'd had a contentious relationship for a long time.
Gemma's friends tell police that the older the two got, the more of an impact Tony's attitude seemed to have on their relationship.
Compared to his sister Gemma, Tony was essentially a failure in his life. And it seems to be that he built up a heavy resentment towards other members of his family who were more successful than him.
Tony had embittered feelings about Gemma's acting success. He felt like she was a bit full of it.
After their mother was hospitalized, tensions between the two reached a boiling point.
Their mum, Pauline, had acted as a buffer between the two of them. So when she left home to have treatment for her brain tumour, Tony and Gemma were just left to argue.
Tony's life just seemed to be going downhill. He'd had trouble with his girlfriend and his drug use was getting worse. Gemma had to handle everything with him just sitting on the couch. So it's not hard to see how that would have thrown fuel on the fire.
It was now open warfare between brother and sister, and only a matter of time before they fell out so spectacularly that one or the other was going to kick the other one out.
She and a few girlfriends were having this impromptu party, and she brought it up.
She'd had a fallout with her brother Tony that morning because he'd left the taps on in the bathroom and it had flooded the house. She's been left at the house while Pauline, their mother, has gone into the hospital to have this treatment for the cancer. Gemma's in charge of the house.
This was just symptomatic of the sort of behaviour she'd become used to and she was frustrated by.
While those girls are discussing that, Gemma actually receives a telephone call from Tony, and there's an argument that goes on where Tony is shouting at Gemma.
He's so loud, they all hear him through the phone. And this is the last straw for Gemma. She decides she has been putting up with him for far too long.
She told him, "Pack your bags, get out. I'm going off now, and when I come back, I do not expect you to be here." Tony's response to that ultimatum was to ignore it. He was going nowhere, and she could take a jump as far as he was concerned.
Gemma left Erica's around 1 p.m. and she headed home to confront Tony.
Did Gemma's attempt to evict Tony from their home end in her death? Her friends believe it's possible.
They told police that Gemma would appear from time to time in dark glasses. She would have bruises on her arms and complained that Tony was hitting her about.
Investigators obtain a search warrant for the McCluskie home, hoping to find some evidence linking Tony to the crime.
In the kitchen, there was a knife block, and in the knife block, one of the knives had some blood on it. Now, that sounds great and evidentially. However, who's not cut their hand on a sharp knife at some stage in a kitchen?
In the bathroom, they also find some very small blood spots that turn out to be Gemma's. But once again, it's a tiny amount of blood, and there are dozens of reasons why a spot of her blood might be there.
It wasn't enough huge amounts of blood that, would be clear signs of a dismemberment activity.
The forensic techs also didn't find any sign of a clean-up.
If somebody was murdered in blood spatters and you wipe it down, we can use chemical agents. You can see the clear-up marks and all this. But there wasn't any of that.
Police looked through Tony's text messages and found that he had sent a message to his sister the morning after she had last been seen, telling her that he had been to the hospital and seen her mother and that she was fine.
He signed it "Love Ya," which was something that caught people's eye.
But when police look into the allegations of domestic violence, a clearer picture of Tony's character begins to emerge.
We established a couple of violent incidents between the two previously. Their father told us that Tony had actually gone for Gemma at one stage and kind of put his hands around her throat. And we found some documentation from about 6 or 7 years previous to this, where Pauline had wanted the council to rehouse Tony because he'd become too unmanageable.
The record of abuse causes investigators to consider Tony's text to Gemma in an entirely different light.
Many times, an abuser will show signs of remorse immediately after a violent outburst as a way of controlling the victim. Something like that could be going on here.
Police obtained Tony's phone records, and they went through all his phone calls, his texts, his geographical data, just to find out where he'd been that day.
Police also review the statements they've collected, and several inconsistencies jump out.
Tony had told some of his friends that the last time he'd seen Gemma was on the morning of Gemma's disappearance. On another occasion, to a different friend, he'd told them that it was in the afternoon.
It turned out that on the day he'd reported Gemma missing, several people had noticed that he had an injury on his hand. At the time, no one knew she'd been killed, so it didn't seem suspicious. But he'd given friends and family different explanations about how it happened.
At one stage, he'd called it in a gate. On another occasion, we'd found out from somebody that he'd been involved in a fight.
It's enough to make Tony their primary suspect.
The fact that he had had a row with her that day, that he had seemed to be a bit shifty, it kind of gave us reasonable grounds to suspect he was involved. He was purporting to be, a loving brother, and that wasn't the case.
Police were convinced they had the right man, so they decided they would rattle his cage and see what he had to say.
But when Tony is informed that he's under arrest, he invokes his right to remain silent.
As a witness, he was really helpful and cooperative and willing to provide explanations. But immediately, as a suspect, we get very little from Tony.
He wants to play the grieving brother. However, when he gradually starts to recognise that his story isn't playing out the way he wishes it to, he becomes obstructive.
He replied to every question with the words, "No comment."
On the evening of March 2nd, just after Gemma had disappeared, Tony had called a minicab service.
The minicab driver remembered the telephone call and they remembered the person.
When the driver went to pick him up, he had a large suitcase with him. It's extremely heavy, and Tony had given him an odd explanation.
He had asked Tony what's in it, to which Tony replied, a stereo system. The cabby had no idea what it was, but he was convinced that whatever it wasn't stereo equipment.
The address Tony gave him turned out to be even stranger.
From the account given by the driver, the car is driven to a road called Dunstan Road, which is right next to the canal where Gemma's torso is found.
Police seized the taxi and had it forensically examined, and inside the trunk they found Gemma's blood.
Investigators immediately review the CCTV cameras surrounding the location where the cab dropped Tony off.
Because of the length of the canal and the current, detectives hadn't known where Gemma's remains were dumped. They also didn't know exactly what to look for, but now they not only had a specific address, but a specific time as well.
Theoretically, police could have pulled footage from all the CCTV cameras all along the canal, but that would have taken months. They would have been looking for a needle in a haystack, but at least now they knew what and who they were looking for.
And what we saw is an image of a man who, of course, we now know to be Tony, dragging this suitcase along the canal.
Footage from another CCTV camera showed Tony later that night going home without the suitcase.
The new evidence gives detectives a much clearer picture of what happened.
Investigators deduced that Tony killed Gemma in their home after she arrived back from the small party held at her friend Erica's home.
It seemed pretty clear that Gemma had come home in a furious temper to find Tony still in the house and had confronted him with her ultimatum that he had to be out and that the struggle had been sparked by that moment, and that was how she met her death.
The fact that Tony left with a suitcase means he must have dismembered his sister in the house. And there was so little blood, he must have taken extraordinary precautions to prevent that.
Police suspect that the traces of Gemma's blood on the kitchen knife meant it was one of the tools he'd used. But they knew it wouldn't hold much weight with a jury for the same reasons they initially overlooked it.
Post-mortem examination showed that it had taken more effort to sever the first limbs than the rest. This supports the theory that he started off by using a knife and then progressed to using an axe.
he might have gone and bought the axe or a sharp knife. We never found the weapon. We never found the clean-up tools, if that was the case. But that's most likely what's happened.
On the 10th of March 2012, 10 days after Gemma's disappearance, Tony McCluskie is formally charged with her murder.
The final piece of evidence turned up before the trial started, and this was Gemma's head from another part of the canal.
The circumstances of that were that local members of the community were clearing out the rubbish near side basin for a local event, and her head was discovered within a kind of a bin bag.
A forensic examination of Gemma's skull confirms that she was beaten to death.
We know from the pathologist that there are bruises to Gemma's limbs, so there's been a fight and she's probably been pushed or punched, or an altercation has taken place between the two of them.
From the state of the skull, the pathologist was able to deduce that Gemma had been struck twice with a heavy, blunt object.
So 2 significant blunt force trauma bruised the skull. He's hit her with something really heavy, and that has cracked her skull, and she's died as a result of that.
Tony pleads not guilty to murder, but rather than claim Tony's innocence, the defense argues that he should be convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter.
Tony admitted that when Gemma came home, they'd gotten into a fight and it had just escalated out of control.
He told jurors that he remembered Gemma shouting at the top of her voice, "Why are you still here? Why aren't you out?" He then said that his sister came at him with a knife, and that in self-defense, he grabbed her wrists and forced her to the ground. From that moment on, his memory blacks out.
He says he snapped and has no memory of dismembering the body or covering up a murder.
However, the prosecution argues that Tony's actions following Gemma's death prove he's lying.
This wasn't a spontaneous act of loss of control. This was something that, once he had killed his sister, he set about firstly destroying the evidence and then laying a very detailed and extraordinarily convoluted cover-up story. This was a man, a killer, who was knowing exactly what he did and exactly how he was going to escape justice.
The fact that he organises searches, texts her phone pretending that he's worried about her, that demonstrates that he really was intending to pull the wool over the eyes of the police. It's as simple as that.
What we know now is that Tony doesn't get rid of the body on the Thursday, on the 1st. He's got his dead sister's body in the house, and he's got to get rid of that somehow. And in the next 12, 24 hours, he clearly works out what he's going to do, and he's going to cut Gemma up and take her and put her into the local canal. That's the choice he made.
The jury agrees, and on the 30th of January, they render their verdict.
Tony's found guilty of murder and jailed for a minimum term of 20 years. He won't be released until 2033 at the very earliest.
The claims of amnesia was clearly a complete and utter load of rubbish, and the jury was not going to fall for stuff like that. They convicted him by 11-1 majority.
It had begun as a sibling rivalry, but it ended in a way no one could have ever imagined.
When the guilty verdict was returned, there were gasps around the court from Gemma's family and friends, not so much in surprise, but in the shock final realization that her own brother had carried out this brutal murder.